Ready to dive into the wild world of American politics? We're going deep on elections this time, folks, and we've got a real stack of readings to unpack.
Yeah, it's like we've got our decoder reams ready, trying to crack the code of American politics.
Totally. And speaking of codes, the 2000 election, Bush versus Gore, man, what a nail biter. I remember thinking, is this even real?
Right. It felt like something out of a movie. But this source claims that those super close elections and all the controversy, it's not as unusual as you might think.
Really?
Yeah, they actually found parallels back in the 1800s. Imagine that. The same kind of drama playing out over a century apart.
So some things never change. But okay, what made the 2000 election so crazy? Wasn't it all about the Electoral College?
The Electoral College was huge. This source breaks it down using California and Delaware as examples. Like a vote in California is one of 55 electoral votes, but in Delaware, it's part of a much smaller 3.
Wild, right? It's like voters are playing this weird statewide game within the national election.
Totally. And it means, because of this system, someone can actually win the popular vote, but still lose the presidency, which of course is what happened in 2000.
Right, which is what led to all those legal battles, right?
Exactly. Democrats are saying, hey, there was voter suppression, especially in minority communities, problems with the Florida recount. Republicans were arguing the opposite, saying, no, the first count was right, and recounting would just undermine the whole thing.
It was a mess. And in the end, the Supreme Court stopped the recount, giving the win to Bush.
Yeah. And this source argues that that really hurt people's trust in elections. Both sides felt suspicious of each other. And it led to even more scrutiny of the whole voting system, from registration to, well, we'll get to it, but even the electronic voting machines.
And speaking of which, there's been a lot of talk about the Department of Justice and how it enforces the Voting Rights Act. Didn't this source talk about those voter ID laws?
It did. Republicans are often saying these laws are needed to stop voter fraud. But then the Democrats are countering, saying that kind of fraud is actually super rare. They argue it really just ends up making it harder for minorities to vote because they're less likely to have those specific IDs.
Ah, that makes sense. It's almost like history repeating itself. Voting rights are still such a big deal.
It's true. And get this, both parties have been accused of trying to rig the system in their favor. Think back to Tammany Hall, remember them? Or what about the accusations against Mayor Daley in Chicago back in 1960?
Wow, it's kind of mind-blowing when you realize how long people have been trying to manipulate elections.
It really is. And it makes you think about, well, the whole system itself. Which leads us to, like I mentioned, electronic voting machines. Remember all that controversy about Diebold?
Vaguely. Remind me about that.
So Diebold, they were a big manufacturer of these voting machines. And people were saying the machines had security flaws, that there was no transparency in how they were programmed. Some folks even wanted to go back to paper ballots because they were worried about hacking and a lack of paper trails, for verification.
So you've got these potential problems with the technology, plus all this suspicion about manipulation. No wonder people are skeptical.
Right. And then, of course, there's the whole other elephant in the room, campaign finance.
Oh, yes, money in politics. It's like its own election happening in the background.
Exactly. This source goes into hard money versus soft money. Hard money has limits and is given directly to candidates. But soft money, that's where things get fuzzy. It's often funneled through these political action committees or other groups that don't have as much oversight.
Like those 527 groups.
Exactly. The McCain-Feingold Act tried to get some control over this, but there are always loopholes, right?
It's crazy. So you've got the Electoral College, voting rights, campaign finance. It's like you have to go through an obstacle course before you can even vote.
You got that right. And even then, we haven't even gotten to the whole primary process.
With those early primaries like Iowa and New Hampshire, those always seem super important. Why is that again?
Well, they kick things off, right? And that gives those early winners a ton of momentum and media attention. This source does a good job of comparing the Democrats and the Republicans. Democrats use a proportional system, so delegates are awarded based on how many votes each candidate gets. But Republicans, they have this mix of winner-take-all and proportional systems, which can mean one candidate gets a lot of power really fast.
And what about those kingmakers in the Republican Party? This source mentions something about them.
Oh yeah. Kingmakers are these powerful people or groups who can really influence who gets nominated. They aren't necessarily running for office themselves, but they can really rally support for their chosen candidate.
Wow. So before we even get to the general election, there's already all this strategizing going on behind the scenes.
It's all part of the game. American politics, it's complex, fascinating, and yeah, definitely has its share of drama.
So we've talked about all the hurdles to even get to an election. But then there's the whole other side of things, like what are we actually voting on?
Right, the issues themselves.
Exactly. And let's be real, few things get people fired up, like talking about the economy.
Oh, absolutely. And,
Mhm.
it's a bit like trying to understand a whole different language sometimes. All those terms, policies.
Right. It can feel pretty overwhelming.
It definitely can be, which is why we have to start with, well, I guess the big dog in the room, the Federal Reserve.
They're like the puppet master of the economy, right?
Yeah.
Controlling those interest rates.
That's one way to put it. This source dives into how those interest rates actually affect everything. I mean, they influence how much it costs for people to get a loan, for businesses to invest. It even affects how fast the economy grows overall.
So if the Fed lowers rates, it's like they're giving the economy a little boost, encouraging people to borrow and spend more.
Exactly. But then if they raise rates, it's like tapping the brakes, trying to, keep inflation from getting out of control. But finding that sweet spot, that's the tricky part.
Yeah.
Which is what makes the whole Alan Greenspan thing so interesting.
Oh yeah, Greenspan. He was like the economic rock star, and then the housing bubble happened.
Yeah, this source really goes into detail about his time as Fed chair and how he approached interest rates. See, he kept them low to help the economy grow. But some economists say that actually backfired because it led to the housing bubble. People were taking out mortgages they couldn't afford because it was so easy to borrow money.
It's kind of like a classic example of you try to do something good, but then there are these unintended consequences.
Exactly. It's a delicate balance. And speaking of delicate balances, can we talk about taxes for a minute?
Oh boy, taxes. You know you're going to get a lively debate going with that one.
You're telling me. And this source on the Bush tax cuts, it really highlights how taxes become this political battlefield.
Because Republicans generally want lower taxes, and Democrats often support higher taxes, at least for, like, the wealthy, right?
Right. So the Republicans, they were saying these Bush tax cuts, especially the ones for wealthier folks, would help the whole economy. Their argument was that it would encourage investment and then everyone would benefit. The whole trickle-down theory.
Right. Like a rising tide lifts all boats.
Exactly. But the Democrats, they were pushing back. They said those cuts really just helped the rich get richer while exploding the deficit and not doing much for the middle class. And then, of course, you had the whole debate about the estate tax.
The estate tax, that's the one on inheritances, right?
Yep. And this source really dives into the two sides of that argument. Is it double taxation, like some people say? Or is it a way to make things a little fairer when it comes to inherited wealth?
It's a tough one. But okay, let's move on to, I guess, the big kahuna, the national debt. Trillions of dollars. It's almost impossible to wrap your head around.
Yeah, it's a mind-boggling number. And this source talks about deficit spending, which is basically when the government spends more than it takes in.
Which is what's been happening for a while now, right?
Right. And there's a lot of debate about it. Some economists say it's actually necessary sometimes to keep the economy going, but others say it'll catch up with us eventually, leading to inflation and all sorts of problems.
So are we headed for a financial crisis? Should we be worried?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? This source talks about the risks of being a debtor nation, especially on the global stage. If other countries lose confidence in our ability to pay back what we owe, that could have some serious consequences for everyone.
It's a lot to think about, but I guess that's the thing about economics. There are no easy answers.
Exactly. It's all about trying to find that balance. Speaking of balance, are you ready to dive into the world of foreign policy? Because that's where things get really complicated.
Okay, so we've tackled elections, we've wrestled with the economy, but we're not done yet. Because now it's time to dive into the world of social issues. And let's be real, these are the ones that can really get people fired up.
You're not kidding. These issues get to the heart of what people believe, their values. It's where things get really interesting and complicated.
Totally. So let's jump right in. And I think a good place to start might be environmental policy. It seems like climate change is on everyone's mind these days.
It's definitely a hot topic.
Yeah.
And this source does a good job of showing how diverse the environmental movement really is. You've got some folks who are coming at it from like a moral perspective, saying we have a duty to protect the planet for future generations.
Right, like that whole idea we don't inherit the earth, we borrow it from our children.
Exactly. But then you have others who are more focused on the immediate impacts, like how pollution affects our health, air quality, clean water, all of that. And then, of course, there's the elephant in the room, global warming.
Yeah, that's the big one. It seems like every other day there's a new study about rising sea levels or extreme weather or all the terrible things that could happen if we don't do something.
And this source does a really good job of laying out the science behind it all, how all those greenhouse gases are trapping heat, warming the planet. But it also talks about how complicated it is to actually fix it. You've got international agreements, domestic policies, trying to switch to renewable energy. It's a lot.
It's overwhelming, honestly. And then there's the whole issue of like our reliance on fossil fuels. We always hear about the need for energy independence.
Right. And that ties into the debate about drilling for oil in places like ANWR. This source frames it as this classic dilemma: do we prioritize energy independence and economic growth, or do we protect these pristine environments? There are no easy answers.
It's a tough one. And speaking of tough choices, we have to talk about the culture wars. Gun control, abortion, same-sex marriage, these issues are so divisive.
They really are, because they're not just about specific policies. They tap into these deeply held beliefs about what's right and wrong, about how we should live our lives.
It's like people are talking past each other sometimes.
Totally. Take gun control, for example. This source goes into the arguments on both sides. You've got people saying, look, we need stricter laws to prevent gun violence, to stop these mass shootings. And then you have others who see it as an attack on their Second Amendment rights.
And it's a similar story with abortion, pro-choice versus pro-life. It's about a woman's right to choose, but also about the sanctity of life.
Exactly. And these debates, they go beyond just this specific issue. It becomes about individual liberty versus the common good, about the role of religion in society, about what it even means to be an American.
It's heavy stuff.
Yeah,
It seems like those same tensions, those different values, they also play out in debates about the economy and social programs.
Absolutely. Like when we talk about things like illegal immigration or the labor movement or even Social Security, this source really digs into the heart of it. Some people believe in a smaller government, that individuals should be responsible for themselves. Others think the government needs to step in to help those in need, to make sure everyone has access to healthcare, education, a living wage.
It's like that classic debate, right? Individual responsibility versus collective action. Do we prioritize the needs of the many or the needs of the few?
That's the question. And it even pops up in discussions about homeland security. How do we keep the country safe while still protecting individual freedoms? Especially after 9/11, that's become a huge challenge.
Yeah, it's like walking a tightrope, and it seems like there's no instruction manual for any of this.
Not at all. This source makes it clear it takes constant work. We have to be vigilant, have these tough conversations, and be open to different points of view. There's no easy solution.
Well, that's American politics for you. It's messy, it's complicated, and it's always evolving. But that's what we've been trying to do with this deep dive, right?
Absolutely. We've covered a ton of ground here, from the ins and outs of elections to the economic forces shaping our lives, and then, of course, all those hot-button social issues that really get to the heart of who we are as a nation.
It's been a wild ride. But if there's one thing I hope our listeners take away from this, it's that being informed, being engaged, it's more important now than ever.
Couldn't agree more. Knowledge is power, right? So keep asking those tough questions, folks. Keep learning, and most importantly, keep using your voice.
It's your body.